Hi guys, Danielle here with GetTestObsessed, and today I want to talk to you about the situations and phrases that you'll want to take notes on at the beginning of lectures that you hear on the TOEFL and in your university program. Remember, the TOEFL is designed to mimic university scenarios, so there is going to be a lot of overlap. So make sure you know these phrases for success on both test day and beyond. Before we cover the phrases that you're most likely to encounter at the beginning of a lecture, I want to talk about the three main categories that can be used to describe how a class begins. In my experience, you can really classify them into three big groups. The first one is when the professor uses the first several minutes of class to talk about those housekeeping items. This is going to mean the logistical items that they need to give you, like reminders or updates about the course itself. If you're in a university program and the professor is taking those first several minutes to reiterate how your grade is being calculated or to give you a reminder about upcoming deadlines, you definitely want to take note of this information. Maybe write it down in that planner. This is a common way of starting off class, not as likely to hear it on the TOEFL, but if they are going out of their way to make announcements, you might see that in one of the function questions on the listening section of the TOEFL. Another way that professors will frequently start class is with a brief recap of the last lesson. This is particularly useful if the lessons go together. Perhaps the last lesson was an introduction or an overview of a particular topic, and in this lesson, you're going to go into more of the specifics or maybe cover a particular controversy that's related to that bigger topic. When you are taking notes on the TOEFL, if this is the strategy the professor uses, make sure you're really, really careful when answering the main idea listening question. The main idea question is going to ask you for the overall gist of the lecture. However, if the professor is recapping the last lesson first, what you have at the beginning of your notes, maybe even the first word that you took notes on in that opening 2 or 3 sentences, might actually describe the main idea of the last lesson instead of the main idea of this lesson. So be particularly careful if that is the structure that the professor is using. While those other two structures are possible, the most likely one that you'll hear is when a professor is going to go straight into the new material. This is most likely on the TOEFL because obviously TOEFL lectures are much, much shorter than actual university lectures. Just because this seems much more straightforward doesn't mean that the professor is going to use the same language to do this each and every time, making it a little bit more complicated than you might at first think. It's possible that the professor will start with a sentence like, "Today I will talk about blank." However, it's equally possible that the professor is going to use a different phrase in order to make that same exact statement. It might be something like taking the topic and making it into its own opening sentence without anything else in order to capture your attention. Something like William Shakespeare. However, even more likely is that the professor is going to use one of these phrases in order to introduce the topic. Remember, all of these phrases is going to have the same function, the same idea, introducing the topic of the lecture. Some of them will come with a slightly different nuance, but they're still getting at the same core, the same key component that will be the central topic of that day's discussion. Which brings us to our first one. Today we will discuss. Be careful with this and don't be misled. Sometimes native speakers will use this to tell you that it's the main topic without actually engaging in a discussion. Just because the professor uses this verb doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to hear a ton of student interaction. So even if the professor says, today we will discuss, you might just hear the professor speaking for the entire time on that one topic. But of course, be sure to take note of that word that comes after discuss, as that's going to be your main idea. Today we will dive deeper is frequently used when you have that recap opening, when you do have a more general introduction to the topic, and then you're going to get into the specifics. Today we will investigate, explore, or cover are all used in the same kind of way. When you are hearing something like we'll discuss, investigate, explore, or cover, make sure to note not only the word that comes directly after it, but also make sure that if the professor says something like, today we will cover blank in particular, or specifically, or with a focus on, make sure to note that too. The professor is indicating the subtopics that he or she will also be focusing on, and that type of organization is so important when taking notes, especially for something like the TOEFL, where you have to go through your notes very quickly to answer the listening comprehension questions. Even though you may have heard words like investigate, explore, and cover in other situations, you'll want to make sure that in this context, you understand that it is generally going to be introducing the topic and not necessarily meaning to find evidence, to go on an adventure, or to hide something. While those are other situations in which you would use those words, it's not what it's going to mean at the beginning of a lecture. Instead, it's going to be just the same as today we're going to talk about blank. When it comes to our next one, today we will consider the professor is likely to be using this if there's going to be more than one way to interpret some particular situation. So keep that in mind when taking notes on this particular language. Today we will examine is going to be very similar. It might give you a subtle hint that there are other ways to approach this topic. The last one today we will deal with is particularly useful for talking about things that might be a little bit complicated. There might be some sort of debate surrounding this, or maybe there's something that is unclear or problematic about the particular topic. In any event, no matter which of the phrases the professor is using, make sure to take note after one of those strong verbs, and make sure that if you hear the phrase in particular, specifically, or any sort of synonym for it, you make note of that as well. I hope you found these phrases for the beginnings of lectures extremely helpful. If you like this video, please be sure to subscribe and come on over to our website at GetTestObsessed.com for more information for both TOEFL and university success. I'll see you next time. Bye.